All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So last time we said we would talk this morning about some of those torso models, and we would also talk about the brain model, and then we would do our spinal cord lecture. So that's still the plan for today. So I think I'm just going to start with kind of lab stuff, and then we'll go over and kind of end talking about the spinal cord. So for your muscle models, right, we've already talked about this red arm. I went over that in one session last week. And then we talked about the leg on Monday, right? So for the test, you need to know the leg, the arm, and then I believe just Professor Knudsen is testing you with this pink arm with no numbers. So I don't plan on going over this in SI, but basically the way you would study this pink arm is you would lay it side by side with the red arm. And the terms that you would need to know are going to be the same on both. Okay, so for example, right here, if I zoom in on, this muscle, we said that that was pronator teres, right? And then if I look on the pink arm to the same muscle at the same spot, I should see pronator teres up here. Does that make sense? Subscapularis would be subscapularis. So what you do is you can study it side by side with the pink arm that has the numbers, all right? So when I took the exam, I did have this arm on my lab exam, okay? So you very well could be tested on it, confirm with your professor whether he plans to use it. It's the same, same exact stuff as is on the red arm. It just doesn't have any numbers, so you would study it side by side. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? So you may or may not see this on your lab exam. Just confirm with your professor. You will all have this red arm with numbers and the pink or red leg with numbers. And then you also have the torsos. Okay, so there are actually 3 torsos plus this little torso. And I'll go over the little torso and one of the big torsos. And the reason, if you guys click in here, remember that this Google Drive link can be found in your study resources module. Whether you're taking Bender or Knudsen, you should have access to this. And in the study resources module, there is the guide to muscles, which I've already told you guys about. And then there's the muscles images. And if you click the muscles images, that brings you right here. Okay. Inside of that, we have a torso model here, completely labeled for you guys. Front and back. Okay. And then this torso model is also labeled back, right, front. So for that reason, I'm not going to relabel those 2 models. Okay, like I said, they're already labeled for you guys. So I'm not going to relabel them here. There's additional pictures and you guys could, print. What I recommend is printing these and taking them with you into lab so you can practice labeling. Okay. All right, so we have one more model right here that is not labeled. So we don't have a labeled version of this, but we do sometimes use this on the exam. So I'll just try to kind of highlight the muscles here you're supposed to know, and I'll make sure we reference our little list. So this would be your erector spinae. Erector spinae. That makes sense because it's next to the spinal column, kind of there to keep the spine upright. You guys would already know that this would be your gluteus maximus, right? Your biceps femoris, long head, and semitendinosus. Those are kind of things that you already know from going over the leg. So remember our biceps femoris long head is lateral, and then our semitendinosus is going to be medial. And then you have your gluteus, medius, and your gemellus superior, obturator internus, and gemellus inferior, right? I'm kind of doing these quickly because I feel like you probably guys have gone over these at some point at this point. Obturator internus, if you've been studying the muscles like you should be for that final lab exam, gemellus interior inferior. And then our last one is our quadratus femoris, right? So you will be retested on the leg muscles that you guys can see. So if you're able to visualize them on this torso model, they could appear on the exam. Same thing with the arm muscles, deltoid, we can clearly see that that's the deltoid. It does get a little bit less likely you'll be tested in here, but we can see that this would be the infraspinatus, right? And then technically what we're seeing over here is that teres minor, and this bigger one would be teres major. Teres minor, teres major. I would say the reason you don't want to leave these torsos until like the day before the final is because some of the muscles do look pretty different from model to model. So for example, teres minor and teres major, the location of them is the same. But on this model, you guys see, it's like you're looking at someone who works out a lot. It's like he has very big, pronounced muscles versus your arm muscle model that you guys learn with is kind of like studying with a child's arm. Like all the muscles are there, they're in the same locations, but they're just very small. So for him, he has a very large teres major. You know, he's been working out a lot, right? He has like a very big teres major. On the other arm, it's very small. So the reason you guys want to look at these is because some of these muscles can look different, and we don't want you guys to get to the exam and then be saying, oh, well, like this looks really, really different. I wasn't expecting that. Well, you were supposed to look at all of the different models so that you, on the exam, you weren't thrown off by their appearance. Does that make sense? And then over here, we have the latissimus dorsi. And a few here that are kind of cut off. I believe that's the infraspinatus. You don't need to worry about these ones. Okay. Technically, the torsos, we're using this list right here. So again, technically, we would be guiding you on this list for your exam. So for what you would be tested on, you would be referencing this list. If there was something else that you were tested on, it would be something that you've already seen on another model, but the likelihood of that is pretty slim. You're really just wanting to check out this list for what you need to be responsible for. Okay, so this is the back of this model. Then let's look at the front. So here's the front of the model. Here is a close-up view of the butt, but we already just did this. The only one I didn't show you was semimembranosus and gracilis. So gracilis, semimembranosus, and like I had said, this is semitendinosus. So this is gracilis. Although they might be classifying this. I think they're saying that this is adductor magnus. Yeah, because adductor magnus is higher up versus semimembranosus would be lower down. So this is again semitendinosus. You can see that. So take another look at the butt muscles. Like I said, these will be on your test because you needed to know them on a different model. Okay. All right. So front of this model, and then we'll look at the little torso and then move on. So for the front, let's see if I can get this a little closer. Almost had it. Trying to move it on the wrong spots. What's going on here? There we go. So there are some muscles of the front of the legs that you guys need to know. What to try to just zoom on those. I don't think this thing lets me like zoom in down there. Oh, there we go. Okay. So let's try to label those guys. Tensor fascia latae, you already know. Vastus intermedius, you already know. Intermedius. Tensor fascia latae. And then we have our, remember we said IPA, right? So iliopsoas pectineus, and this is adductor longus. So this is I, iliopsoas, P, pectineus, A, adductor longus. And then in the middle, gracilis, right? Because it's that muscle that goes down the center. And we have our rectus femoris right here, rectus femoris. This right here is the rectus femoris, but it was like cut off to show you the vastus intermedius. So potentially that could be labeled on the exam, rectus femoris. Tensor fascia latae, we already said. And then this would be sartorius right here. Sartorius, which is also cut off on the other side. So this 28 is sartorius. You also can visualize on this model the external and the internal oblique. You can see on this side, external oblique. I'm like writing it over where it's labeled. It's more superficial. Over here, internal oblique is deeper. And it's easier to see that when we actually zoom out because you see the side with the bone exposed. Oh, there you go. Right there at the top of the screen. Do you guys see how there's bone exposed? So that's the internal oblique, right? And then the side with the no bone exposed is external oblique. And then these are the rectus abdominis muscles, right? So your ab muscles are rectus abdominis muscles. Okay. Any questions there? And as we get closer to the exam, I can go over any of this again as well. All right, so what we're looking at here is the little torso. This one is going to be tested for you guys, so I'll just quickly label it. There's not a whole lot on here, but you do need to know it. So this is the levator scapulae. Okay, so it's lifting the scapula. Over here, we have our supraspinatus and infraspinatus, right? Supraspinatus, infraspinatus. And then we have the rhomboid minor and rhomboid major. Rhomboid minor, number 20, rhomboid major. Just remember the majors on the bottom. Then you have your erector spinae. Like I said, it runs up and down, keeping the spine erect. Then we have our intercostal muscles. So B shows you guys the intercostal muscles. This is the only model where you guys can see the intercostal muscles. So intercostals right there in between the ribs, right? A is our serratus posterior. And then we have over here the trapezius major and the latissimus dorsi, right? Trapezius and latissimus dorsi. Right, so that's everything for this little model. I would highly recommend, taking a screenshot or having this somewhere, because we don't have a picture with all of the answers on it. And again, this is the only model where you guys can see intercostals. All right, any questions there? All right, I'm going to go ahead and erase. And then, so that should be all that you would need on the little torso. Okay, again, there's this picture, but it just shows you with the levator, scapula, and trapezius back on it, which we already talked about, this one, and then this one's non-labeled. Okay, so that's everything for the muscles. So we've gone over our arm, our leg, and our torso. And I'm gonna save the brain for the end of today's SI. I want to transition over to lecture. And then with the time we have left, we'll come back to the brain. And just let me know if you guys have any questions for me as you've been studying and going over stuff. If something comes up, just let me know. Oh, awesome. Okay, so for spinal cord. So we already talked about brain, right? And the brain, we talked about like all of the different anatomy of it. Remember, spinal cord is still a part of the central nervous system. When we get nerves coming off of the spinal cord, that would be peripheral nervous system. But as far as the spinal cord is concerned, it is the central nervous system. It has two functions. The first function you guys kind of already know, right? Let's talk. It is a pathway for sensory and motor information, right? You sense something and it travels up the spinal cord to the brain. And then your brain sends back a command and it travels down as motor. The second function is reflexes. So reflexes are those immediate response to an impulse, and we will talk about those as well. All right, so that's the two functions of the spinal cord. The chapter is kind of organized, again, like I always say, I don't always love the way these are organized. So it talks about the anatomy of the spinal cord and the fact that the spinal cord has 5 parts. So 5 parts. Part 1 is cervical. Part cervical has 8 cervical nerves that come off of it. So what it's trying to say is if this is the brain, this is the spinal cord, it's divided up into 5 sections that kind of go along it. Here's number 1 with 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 nerves that come off of that section. The next section is your thoracic, which you guys remember has 12 vertebrae. It has 12 thoracic nerves. For cervical, you guys learned that it had 7, we add 1, right? So here's thoracic. Thoracic had 12 coming off of this little section here. Then it's lumbar. Lumbar has 5 lumbar nerves. These are named L1 through L5, T1 through T12, C1 through C8. It's not super complicated, but this stuff will be on the test, so you want to make sure you know it. This is new to you. There are 5 sacral nerves. Sacral is in the area of your sacrum, so 5 sacral nerves. Again, there were 5 lumbar nerves. And then lastly, we have one coccygeal nerve, just one. So one on either side, so that's CO1. Sacral is S1 through S5. So there's not a whole lot there. That's just like an anatomy thing that you want to know. And then we have some more anatomy stuff that we know, and then we start actually talking about the function in just a minute. So a lot of this chapter is terms, and then the function of the spinal cord is something that is going to be hard to answer on a lot of questions and understand. But we'll talk about that. But I just want you to know, like, I'll try to go through the terms, not super slowly, but I want to make sure they're on here so that you guys have them in your notes. So 5 parts is the first thing. Then we go through the characteristics of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has something called the conus medullaris. Conus medullaris. And this is the official end of the spinal cord, and it's a cone shape, and that's why we call it conus. So on this diagram right here, if we show you that this kind of ending of the spinal cord looks like a cone, that would be the conus medullaris, the official end of the spinal cord. But the location of that conus medullaris is not where you would think it would be, where I just drew it, like at the end, not actually where it is. So it's actually located between T12 and L1. So right here, the end of T12 and L1 is the official end of the spinal cord. But obviously, like we just said, nerves keep coming off of it, the spinal cord, as we go down. And those nerves that come off of the spinal cord after the end also have a name, filum terminal. Okay, so this is where it's a little bit confusing, but I'll just try to make it very simple. So filum terminal and cauda equina was referenced the tissue and then the nerves. So cauda equina, the nerves that flare off the spinal cord after the conus medullaris. And they are called cauda equina because they look like the tail of a horse. Remember, caud means tail, equine means horse. So it's showing you like kind of what I was drawing for you guys. These nerves that come off, the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal would all be cauda equina nerves that look like the tail of a horse. Does that make sense? So all of these guys right here, cauda equina, nerves that flare off the spinal cord after the conus medullaris. Filum terminal is this little piece of tissue right here. Okay, this is pia mater only, that attaches the spinal cord, attaches the, how do we say this? Attaches the conus medullaris to the coccyx, right? Because we just said the coccygeal nerve is like the last nerve. So the part that extends from the conus medullaris down to the coccyx is the filum terminal. So those are kind of 3 different terms you would want to know: conus medullaris, official end, and the fact that it's at T12 and L1. Filum terminal, the fact that it extends as a piece of pia mater from the conus medullaris to the coccyx. And then cauda equina, referencing those last nerves that flare like the tail of a horse. All right, more characteristics of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has a cervical enlargement. This means it's kind of like it is rounded at the cervical part, and then it's also rounded at the lumbosacral part. So lumbosacral enlargement, cervical enlargement. So if we drew that, it would be like it just gets a little like puffy or big in the lumbosacral region, right? Kind of like right there. And then it also is large up here at the cervical part. The way I kind of remember it is it's like your head and your hips, you know, like a huge human would have a large head and then kind of large hips, right? So if you look, cervical enlargement here is kind of by your head, which is large, and then your hips, which are, all humans have larger hips than like their shoulders. Lumbosacral enlargement. And then about your meninges. So we go over the meninges one more time. So I'm going to draw another little thing here, and I'll just kind of remind you of them, but I won't go through them super slowly. I'll just do the simple definitions because we just went over these on Monday, right? So you have your first meninge is your dura mater. Remember, your dura mater is your most external one, and this one sticks to the bone, right? So it's going to stick to the vertebral foramen, right? The outermost layer. Our next layer is our arachnoid mater. And we know this one is really, really special because it has that subarachnoid space. We talked a lot about this on Monday. This has the CSF, it has those arachnoid villi, it has the sinuses. We also talked about the ventricles because those are part of CSF, right? So that's a really important section in your notes that you would want to go over again for spinal cord. Okay, I'm not going to go over it again because, like I said, we just went over it. The last or the deepest layer is pia mater. This one touches the actual spinal cord or the actual brain, right? So in the spinal cord, it's going to be touching white matter. In the brain, it'll be touching gray matter, but that really doesn't matter. What you need to know is that it touches the actual brain or the spinal cord. And then here, I'll draw it in red. This is a new term for you guys when it comes specifically to the spinal cord. They're called denticulate ligaments. They are extensions of the pia mater. Extensions of the pia mater that hold the spinal cord to the sides of the vertebral foramen. So they're like little extensions, if this is my little spinal cord, denticulate ligaments are little triangles, and they kind of keep it held to the bone on the outside. And there's actually on the spinal cord model that we'll go over, you can actually see the denticulate ligaments, and we have you guys label the denticulate ligaments as well. All right, so let's go over the actual spinal cord now. So we'll start talking about the actual spinal cord and its function. So these were kind of some general terms, meninges and anatomy, some different things you need to know. There's going to be some more terms we go over, but let's talk kind of transition, and we'll do our diagram of the spinal cord. Okay. So if there's like the same way that I kind of always do this. So we go in the back, posterior, and then out the front. Yeah, sorry. All right, so our spinal cord, it repeats on either side, but I don't draw it on either side because we kind of run out of room, but just know it would do the same thing on that side. So this is our spinal cord. When we're right here, we're in the central nervous system. When we're out here, we're in the peripheral nervous system. The area at the back is posterior, okay? Now here, anterior. You know it's posterior because you see this section here, which is our dorsal root ganglion, right? Our dorsal root ganglion. On the posterior side, we always deal in sensory information. And the anterior side, we always deal in motor information. So we know that the anterior side will be sending out a command. The sensory side will be receiving a command, right? Sensory comes in, motor goes out. So we always say information comes in the posterior side, goes out the anterior side. Then we have what we always call the butterfly, okay? The butterfly of the spinal cord. This is the gray matter of the spinal cord. We can kind of shade it in. And then I'll probably erase what I shaded in, but just to show you. Gray matter. This is white matter. What did we say white matter is? White matter is myelinated axons, right? Gray matter is going to be everything else. So nuclei, which were what? Cell bodies in the central nervous system. Telodendria, synaptic knobs, dendrites, and then we also said it would have unmyelinated axons too, right? And unmyelinated axons. Right, so that's the gray matter at the center, white matter myelinated axons on the periphery. And like I said, the inside is going to be your central nervous system, and the outside is going to be your peripheral nervous system. So sensory information comes in the back. So let's start doing a little more labeling beyond just sensory information comes in the back. So we call this part right here the trunk of the spinal nerve. Trunk of the spinal nerve. And that's like where those two are together. And then we call this section here, once it leaves after they join, the anterior root. Okay. Coming off of the, where's my other? Coming off of the anterior root, we have two kind of special guys here. I'm trying to draw this here. Okay, we have the rami communicantes here. These two guys are the rami. If you guys have looked at the spinal cord model, that will help you a lot as we go through this. But the rami communicantes kind of come up with that anterior root. And then we have the sympathetic chain of ganglia. So there are multiple of these on each section of the spinal cord, and those are called the sympathetic chain of ganglia. We also have the posterior ramus here, and the posterior ramus supplies the dermatomes. The dermatomes we'll talk about, but they're basically like innervation to specific sections of your skin on your back. And like we already said, there's our motor and our sensory kind of coming out of that section. There are motor or anterior rootlets that attach into the actual spinal cord, and then there's the motor or anterior root, motor root over here, posterior sensory rootlets, and then the sensory root. Like I already said, this is the dorsal root ganglia. All right, so as sensory information comes in the back part of the spinal cord, we remember that we said that sensory neurons are our unipolar neurons, right? So in here, these are unipolar neurons. Okay, unipolar neurons. So unipolar neurons are found in the peripheral nervous system, right? This whole section is the peripheral nervous system. Unipolar neurons are part of the peripheral nervous system, right? Multiple cell bodies. Okay, so when cell bodies join in the CNS, what do we call that? A nuclei, right? But when they join in the PNS, it's called a ganglion. So the reason this is named a dorsal root ganglion is because multiple unipolar cell bodies are in that little kind of bubble right here. So we call that the dorsal root ganglion. So those are those unipolar neurons. We can also call them somatic afferent. So remember all the way back to the nervous tissue lecture, we had the afferent nervous system, which goes away from the spinal cord. F is away. Afferent comes towards the spinal cord, right? Versus our efferent system, we went over this for nervous tissue, right? Goes away, F is away from the spinal cord. So the efferent system is the motor system. The afferent system is the sensory system. So on your test, if it asks you, where are the afferent cell bodies, you would say dorsal root ganglion, right? Those are somatic afferent. That means they are sensory somatic. They're going to they're coming from the body, from what you're aware of, right? Because remember, we had somatic versus visceral, right? Remember the word visceral. So visceral cell bodies, we also will tell you where those are found, but for somatic afferent or somatic sensory cell bodies, those are the unipolar neurons. Again, this is what you are aware of sensing. So the first thing that happens basically is we have that sensory information coming in the back part of the spinal cord. We are aware of sensing that information. So let's erase this part here. So as that sensory information comes in, it's traveling along those unipolar cell bodies. The dendrites and the axons of those unipolar cell bodies will be in the posterior horn. So I always end up running out of room here. Let's erase a few things that I don't necessarily need. Then erase white matter and gray matter. I'll just do this gray matter. And I'll label it in a different white matter. Okay, so in the posterior horn, which is this little section here, is the posterior horn of the spinal cord. So in the posterior horn, we have different structures found in the posterior horn. So we have our, oh, there we go. Sensory, somatic, afferent, somatic, afferent, axons. Okay, so those are those unipolar axons, unipolar axons. And in addition to that, the other thing we find in the posterior horn are the interneuron cell bodies for visceral, let's do blue, for the visceral afferent. So interneuron cell bodies and this is for visceral, sensory / afferent. So those would also be right here. The visceral sensory side, or the interneuron cell bodies, are right there. Then we have our lateral horn here. Okay, this guy. So the lateral horn has the cell bodies of the visceral or autonomic sensory. So lateral motor. So lateral horn has the, we'll do green, visceral or autonomic motor cell bodies. So there's some motor neurons right here found in the lateral horn, but they are specific to visceral or autonomic motor. And then finally we have, see if you guys will put it over here. Finally, we have the anterior horn, and the anterior horn has the somatic motor or efferent cell bodies. Remember that those are multipolar, right? Because we said that the multipolar neuron is a motor neuron. So these would be multipolar for both visceral and somatic motor, versus the sensory side has interneurons for visceral, and it has unipolar for somatic. So our sensory information is coming in. So that sensory information can either be somatic, or we'll draw blue. It could be visceral, right? Then we have our motor information going out. It could go to our smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. If it is autonomic. If it's somatic, it's going to go out to like skeletal muscle. Okay, so this is like an overview. There's a lot going on with when it comes to the spinal cord. It's kind of one of those things where you don't just get it and it clicks in 5 minutes. You kind of have to go over it a few times. I will touch on it some more when we like do review and stuff, but this is the overview of the majority of the content. When it comes to sympathetic chain of ganglia, we'll go over that next week when we cover autonomic nervous system in SI. But for today, I won't talk about that. But for the most part, what we just covered, and kind of a speedy overview, is the majority of what you would need to know, right? Sensory is coming in the back. It has two formats. Either it can be somatic, which has its cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, or it can be visceral, which has its cell bodies in the posterior horn. If it's motor and it's a command going out, it can be autonomic with its cell bodies in the lateral horn, or it can be somatic with its cell bodies in the anterior horn, right? Regardless, those are both going out the front. So if you feel a little overwhelmed or confused, that is pretty normal. I kind of was able to put everything on one picture, so it's not that it's not confusing content. It is confusing content, but usually it just takes a little more going over, and then it all starts to kind of click. So what we just talked about was just the kind of overview of how the spinal cord actually works. We need to keep talking because there's more to this chapter than just that. It's not a whole lot more. We just have a few more terms, and then we talk about reflexes. Okay, so I'll once we finish this, we'll go back and we'll talk about the brain model and the spinal cord models. So we'll kind of go over the spinal cord models as a good way for you guys to review this, so we can kind of be talking about it again. Do you guys have any questions while we're kind of still on this screen before I change over? All right, so as we keep going, so we have spinal cord. I don't really know, maybe we say, I'll put function because I feel like that's what makes the most sense. What we just talked about, I would classify as function. So we talked about basically our sensory versus our motor. And then we talked about the location of all of our cell bodies. So you could probably make a little outline of this. If the outlines really help you, you could do like a sensory side, you could do a motor side, and then you could say, okay, I have my visceral or my autonomic motor, right? Which we said was green. So I have my autonomic motor. Those are in the lateral horn and they're multipolar. And they travel out of the anterior part of the spinal cord. Then I have my somatic motor, which is like what you're aware of controlling. Somatic motor. They are in my anterior horn. They're multipolar. And they travel out of the anterior side of the spinal cord. Then I go over to my sensory side, right? I have my somatic part, which is my unipolar cell bodies found in the dorsal root ganglion, found basically in the peripheral nervous system, PNS, peripheral nervous system. They come in and they finish synapsing in the posterior horn with their axons, right? Then I have my visceral or my autonomic sensory. We did blue, visceral. Those cell bodies were interneurons, and they were located in the the posterior horn as well. Posterior horn. This says anterior horn. Sometimes I think my screen has like a damage on it, and sometimes it like randomly does that where it like won't write for me, multipolar. I don't know why exactly it does that. Anterior. See, it's like doing it again. I don't know. I'm not really sure why it does that. Posterior horn for interneurons, visceral, interneurons, posterior horn. And again, these would be part of the CNS. That was like a very quick summary. There's a lot more you guys need to know. So I don't want to, hopefully that doesn't make it seem like that's what you need to know, everything. That's just kind of the main thing that's going on. But remember, you have more terms that you would need to know, like, you know, how it's leaving the trunk and all of those different things. All those different things that kind of go through that. I might write a quick summary at the end before I move on. Once we go over these terms, I think I'll come back to it, and I have like a summary table that I'll write out. So that's kind of just the overview, but again, I'm going to put and more, right? And more. There's more there that you need to know. I don't want to deceive you into thinking that's everything. So another kind of term for this is the nerve plexus. The nerve plexus references the fact that we have basically multiple areas where the anterior ramus from multiple spinal cord sections weave and join together. So I'm going to go back over here and point out again. So this section is the anterior ramus. So this is the anterior ramus. This is the anterior root over here. This is the anterior ramus. So I actually labeled that wrong earlier. So the anterior ramus is like the part where motor and sensory travel together. Do you see that? Sensory and motor are found together in the anterior ramus. So if I tell you multiple anterior ramuses join up together, you can kind of picture how sensory and motor information from different parts of your spinal cord are all coming into one. And that's called a nerve plexus. So a nerve plexus, when the anterior ramus from multiple spinal cord sections, right, weave and join together. These spinal cord sections, and really what the anterior ramus becomes, is actually a nerve. So what we could do when we go back here is I could draw like an arrow that kind of represents if it continued on. So if I like kept drawing this guy moving on, this now is called a nerve. Does that make sense? This here was the trunk of the spinal nerve. When they travel out, it's the anterior ramus, but when they keep traveling, it's a nerve. So a nerve, like when they say like, oh, well, a surgeon cut a nerve, you know, you hurt your nerve, you damaged your nerve. A nerve has motor and sensory information. That's why somebody who loses nerve control to an area loses maybe the ability to feel, but can also lose the ability to move, right? Because motor and sensory travel together in a nerve. So if we go back over here, a nerve plexus is when basically multiple anterior ramuses, multiple nerves weave and join together. That's called this nerve plexus. The function is to be a backup so that motor commands are not lost in case one gets damaged, right? So if I keep all of those together and I accidentally damage one, that's okay. Now I have a lot of them together. There are 4 plexi. Plexi just means a large plexus. There's a cervical, a lumbar, and a sacral. And this is usually when you guys are thinking this would be thoracic. But this is actually brachial, and I'm writing it in all caps because the plexi are really easy to remember because they're just the same anatomy as the spinal cord, except for the brachial. That's different than the thoracic, right? You need to know the brachial is part of the plexi. Okay, so also part of the spinal cord, you have the intercostal nerves. Intercostal nerves refers to the fact that T1 through T12, right? The thoracic, how I was just showing you that it's not right there as a plexi. Thoracic nerves do not have a plexi, but instead run along the ribs of the rib cage, right? So they're running along those ribs. This keeps them protected. These are also like nerves that are governing your breathing and your heart, right? So we need to make sure we keep them protected. All right, so that's intercostal nerves and nerve plexus. Then we have our neurium. What do I feel like we already went over this? I think I already said this. For some reason, it's seeming very familiar. Epineurium around the nerve. These are coverings, connective tissue coverings. Epineurium would go around the nerve. Perineurium would go around the fascicle. I feel like we definitely did this with nervous tissue, but I'll write it one more time. And then endoneurium would go around the axon. So I'm kind of writing this really quickly because, like I said, I'm pretty sure I already said that. All right, and then lastly, we have your dermatome. And this is before we start talking about reflex. So we still need to go over reflex. So dermatome, what is a dermatome? A dermatome is the fact that lines of cleavage, if you remember, those are basically like sections of your skin sections are innervated. And remember, the word innervated means to be supplied by motor and sensory information, right? So they're innervated with the posterior ramus of the spinal cord. So each line of cleavage would be innervated with one posterior ramus of the spinal cord, except the posterior ramus from C1. So for your test, you just want to know that the posterior ramus innervates the lines of cleavage except C1. Okay, it's not super complicated. It'll definitely be a test question, but you would want to know that it's except C1. C1 is not one of the posterior ramus. Going back to the diagram, this is the posterior ramus right here. So they're going to the dermatomes, which are lines of cleavage, but not C1. So they're all, every posterior ramus goes and supplies a line of cleavage, except the posterior ramus on C1. So if we look at this picture again, and you're kind of like, okay, I'm sort of getting it, it's sort of coming together. So where are these located? You would have one, C2, C3, C4, you get the idea, right? So you're gonna have one of these pictures repeated, and I'm saying one of these pictures, a section of a spinal cord with a branch of a posterior ramus, with a sympathetic chain of ganglia, with a nerve, is going to repeat everywhere. I already told you that they have a nerve. So if you go back to this page, when we said that we have C1 through C8, C2 through C8 has nerves, right? So C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8. T1 through T12, L1 through L5, S1 through S5, and CO1. So all of those look like this picture all the way down the whole spinal cord because we have that many nerves coming off, right? And we obviously have nerves on the right and on the left side. So hopefully it's kind of starting to come together of how it looks and how it functions. So that, what we just went over, what we just spent all that time kind of talking about is our pathway for sensory and motor, right? Pathway for sensory coming in and motor going out. Now what we talk about is reflexes. How does the brain, how does the body and the spinal cord immediately respond to an impulse versus kind of having to do this, what can be complicated process, right? So what you see on this picture that we talked about before has sensory coming in, and then this basically uses that white matter that you see right here to carry the information to the brain. So this allows the brain to make that decision of what motor information comes out. So we bring that sensory information in, it sends that up to the brain using white matter, those myelinated axons, and then the brain sends its signal down of the motor command that it wants to do. But in a reflex, it does not use the brain at all, right? So what does a reflex look like? So reflexes, these do not involve the brain directly. So the brain is involved, it's just not involved in the immediate decision. These are all or nothing. So you either go through the entire process of a reflex or you don't go through anything at all. You have no, they are not voluntary. You have no ability to control them or to counteract them. And then we have what's called the reflex arc. And the reflex arc is basically one neural wiring. So it's the sensory coming from the peripheral nervous system. It goes to the central nervous system, to the interneuron or not. So we'll just put central nervous system. This is in the form of the spinal cord only. And then it goes out to the peripheral effector, the motor. So again, a reflex arc will be the sensory peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord to the peripheral effector. I think someone said they wanted a picture of this. Okay. All right, so for reflexes, we'll try to draw a quick little drawing of the spinal cord because it makes it a little easier. And my other drawing has a lot going on, so. Okay, so in a reflex, we have that sensory information come in. Let's draw my little button. Okay, we have that sensory information come in. That's step one. So step number one, here's my stimulus. That would be sensory stimulus. So for example, you touch something hot like a burner on the stove, and you're going to obviously reflexively pull your hand back. So it's coming in the backside as a sensory stimulus. Then we're going to travel back here through that unipolar, travels through that unipolar side. And then it can either basically be cross over to the other side, which is called a polysynaptic. Try to draw it. So polysynaptic, it can either cross over. This would be a polysynaptic neuron. And this would involve my little interneuron. Interneuron involved. So let's do 3A. So option A, 3A is that it's polysynaptic, or it can just be monosynaptic and travel through the interneuron, but and not travel through the interneuron and just go straight over and synapse with my little motor. So right here, this would be option 3B, monosynaptic, which means it just has one synapse. And this has no interneuron. And then we know our last step, right, would be our motor response going out. So the reflex always comes into the spinal cord. If the reflex, like I said, is a polysynaptic reflex, it involves the interneuron. So one of the things you need to know for the test is a polysynaptic reflex involves the interneuron. And this basically allows the reflex to be bilateral, so to go to both sides. So for example, it can go over here, it'll synapse over here to tell the right side of the body to like respond, as well as the left side. So for example, if I touch a hot burner and I was going to put both hands on the stove, this will pull both hands back. Versus a monosynaptic, maybe I just need to pull one hand back, so it's just going to do on that one side. So a monosynaptic has one synapse and it involves no interneuron. A polysynaptic has more than one synapse, so it's going to involve the interneuron, and you can kind of see that in the picture. You also have the ipsilateral, contralateral come through again. We've already talked about this before. An ipsilateral reflex is when the receptor, that would be like the sensory, and the effector is the motor target, so like your arm or your hand. So when the receptor and the effector are on the same side, we call that ipsilateral. When the receptor and the effector are on opposite sides, like in the polysynaptic reflex, we would call that contralateral. Okay, so we have polysynaptic, monosynaptic, ipsilateral, contralateral. And then finally, we talk about the stretch reflex. We'll do that in blue, stretch reflex. The stretch reflex is monosynaptic, and it's just referencing the fact of like when you guys go to the doctor's office and they tap your knee with that little like hammer. A stretch reflex is when our muscle is stretched and primed to respond. So basically, it's in a position where it's stretched out and it's primed to respond. And this depends upon two factors: the spindle fibers and the Golgi tendon. Spindle fibers are sensory dendrites around the myofibers or muscle cell, and this is part of your stretch reflex, myofibers or muscle cell. And the Golgi tendon are the receptors or the sensory dendrites, right? So they're sensing that stimulus in the actual tendons of the muscle. And both of those contribute to the stretch reflex. Stretch reflex, again, it's the fact that it's like primed to respond, and that depends upon the spindle fibers and the Golgi tendon. All right, so technically that's everything for this chapter, but before we move on, I think it would be helpful to do a really quick summary. I have kind of like a summary page in my notes that really helped me when I was learning the spinal cord. And I think that would be beneficial. So I'm going to write that. And then we will talk about the spinal cord models and the brain model. Okay, leaving Monday of next week for autonomic and then some senses, and Thursday of next week to finish the senses. Okay, and then the following week we'll do kidney and reproductive, and you guys are moving right along for your final as well. Okay. All right, so doing our kind of step-by-step here. So when we look at our little, I might draw some of this again, I might not, but I'll just draw this up here so we at least have a little visual. So there's my mini little spinal cord, right? Just so that you guys can kind of see. And we know that we have our sensory. I'll draw a little unipolar. And then we said that this was my interneuron, my autonomic, and then lastly my motor. Just so you guys can kind of see it. Okay, so step one that we always do it this way, right? Sensory info comes in the posterior root, right? The posterior root, and the posterior comes in the posterior root, which is this little part right here. This little section here comes in the posterior root via somatic, afferent, unipolar neurons. So that's what those are: somatic, afferent, unipolar neurons with cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root ganglion. Axons come in the, and I'll just change the color here, posterior horn. Posterior horn being this little part in the back. I'm going to draw a little arrow, posterior horn. All right, so that was step number 1. Step number 2, the visceral afferent, right? Visceral sensory, visceral afferent axons. The visceral axon cell bodies are interneurons in the posterior horn. Okay, and they'll carry information up to the brain, as will those. Basically, information is carried up to the brain through the white matter that's on the sides over here. So I'll just say info goes up to the brain via white matter. And remember what we said. White matter is myelinated axons. Does anybody remember what a group of myelinated axons is called in the CNS? What is a group of myelinated axons in the CNS called? Tract, right? Good. What is a very large tract called? Anyone remember what a very large tract is called? Okay, good. So we remember that we have nuclei, which are our cell. I'm just going to do this quick recap because this is, you guys need to know this regardless, so it's not going to be a waste of your time to do a recap here. Myelinated axons, CNS. So when multiple nuclei get together, very good, you kind of were on the right track. Center, that's called a center. Many cell bodies. But we know that this, right, would be gray matter. So when I tell you that white matter carries the information, I'm over here, right? White matter is a tract because it's myelinated axons in the CNS. Multiple tracts get together and they're called a funiculus. So we're about to go talk about the spinal cord on the model, and we're going to see that there are funiculus. I'll draw a little red so it stands out. You see this little red circle here? That is a funiculus, and I'm going to show you on the model. So if a funiculus is carrying that information, it's just basically saying it's large tracts. Large tracts is just a lot of myelinated axons going together, right? Now, this is kind of testing you guys a little bit, but I think it's good to do it this way. Where does sensory information end up in the brain? Question mark. And I'll give you a few hints. Where does general sensory information end up in the brain minus smell? Does anybody know what I'm looking for? Where does general sensory information end up in the brain minus smell? Good. Parietal lobe, good. Where on the parietal lobe? There's a specific little structure, right, that receives general sensory, yes, postcentral gyrus, good. So the postcentral gyrus is also called the primary somatosensory cortex. So this example that we're talking about, let's say you sensed, I don't know, you sensed a tickle on your leg. That's going to travel through step number 1, sensory information. It's a little tickle on your leg, comes in the posterior root through the somatic afferent unipolar neurons with cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion. Is it going to use number 2? Not necessarily. So really we could label these 1A and 1B. It's either going to be visceral or somatic, right? You're either going to feel it or you're not. Maybe it's digestion and you don't feel it. But let's say it's going to be something you feel, then it's going to use a tract, right? It's going to basically send a little signal in synapse and use the tract, which is those myelinated axons, Then it's going to use the funiculus. It's going to travel up to the brain. And it's going to end up at the final destination of the parietal lobe. Along the way, it's going to meet a few things that send it. Do you guys remember how we had the thalamus? The thalamus being a switching station for information to send it to the right spot on the parietal lobe. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So the thalamus is actually where those funiculus are going to end up. The thalamus is going to send that information to the parietal lobe, unless it's smell, right? If it was smell, it's going straight to the temporal lobe, right? But if it was not smell, it would be going to the parietal lobe, okay? And remember, it uses central white matter. It kind of would merge into central white matter and projection tracts, but you're not really going to be tested on that. So the part you would, the journey you want to know for the test is what I just drew for you, right? Tract becomes funiculus. Funiculus gets to the thalamus, which switches that information, sending it to the right spot on the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, good. So we just covered sensory information. But we know that that's not all that we do, right? We have to have motor, right? So that's not the whole story. So how do we get motor information to come down? Motor is a little bit more complicated, right? But not really, in a sense. It's kind of just the same thing, but backwards. So motor, we're going to use what's our lobe? Which lobe controls motor? Is it the insula, the frontal, right? So the frontal lobe is for motor. What part? The primary motor cortex on the precentral gyrus, right? So we're getting our motor command coming down. So motor is sending its signal. I should have used yellow that whole time and red now, but too late. So motor is going to send its signal down through the frontal lobe, and it's going to use like different tracts, right? So we're going to use tracts and funiculus. It's going to bring that motor signal all the way down until we get to our anterior horn, because this is somatic that I gave you guys the example of. And then it's going to send that out through the nerve, right? So that's kind of the journey in like up to the brain and down story. But I'm going to erase this and then, well, I guess I could leave it and go to a different page, but I kind of want to erase this and keep going to talk more about like the next little step. All right, so step number 2. Well, step number 2 is really what we just did. Like it communicates it to the brain, but I'm not going to draw that. I'm just going to say step 2A is autonomic motor. So where are our autonomic motor? Our autonomic motor or efferent neurons are located in the lateral horn. And they would be sending a command coming from the brain, right? From the brain. What are the destinations of autonomic? It's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, right? So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And this command can either be excitatory, okay, or it could be inhibitory, excitatory, or inhibitory, just depending on its destination. And we know that the 2 areas that will be involved will be parasympathetic. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to use the anterior ramus, versus the sympathetic nervous system is going to use the sympathetic chain of ganglia, which were part of the rami communicantes, right? So I'm going to put rami communicantes and sympathetic chain of ganglia. So down here, my little rami communicantes, sympathetic chain of ganglia is what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to draw a little green, and I'll draw it kind of coming into here. And then I'll also draw it going out. So again, this would be para, this would be symp. So sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic motor nervous system. And we'll talk about that again on Monday when we talk about autonomic. So that's the autonomic side for motor. And then lastly, we'll do 3. I'm going to do 2B. I'm just doing 2A and 2B because I'm trying to show you that, although I wish I should have really done this 2B. Anyway, the B's, I'm going to change this because of my slight tendencies for OCD. The 2B and 1B are both visceral, right? These two are visceral. They're autonomic, you're not aware. Versus 1A and 2A, I'm trying to show you somatic. So this is somatic, efferent, motor, info, leaves the anterior horn, right, out the anterior root to the trunk of the spinal nerve. The trunk of the spinal nerve is where they join together. All of them go to the trunk of the spinal nerve. I'm just kind of reminding you guys of it. Out the anterior ramus, right, to the effector. The effector is the target. So if that was your foot, it's going to be your foot, right? And so it's sending that all the way out, and that information or the command came from the brain. Okay, hopefully that did not confuse you more. Hopefully that made it a little bit more clear, kind of covering it again and recapping it again. Okay, so do we have any more questions on that? I'm pulling up the spinal cord. No questions. Okay, I'm gonna need to delete these slides. I think everybody probably got everything. Here is the first page, spinal cord. Here was this page where we talked kind of about everything on one. We talked kind of about some additional terms. We covered reflexes, which is pretty simple, just immediately inside the spinal cord. Again, the brain is not notified, like we talked about when we were talking about this page, where I kind of showed you like tract to funiculus, right, to thalamus, to the parietal lobe, the primary somatosensory cortex, and then we have the frontal lobe, and then we go out, down again, down funiculus, down a tract, until we get all the way to the anterior root, and then we send out that command, right, through a nerve. That whole part here, well, actually all of this is not necessary, no, on reflex. So if you have a reflex, you don't need to do any of that. Why? Because you need to respond to something really quickly, right? You're responding to a dangerous situation. You need an immediate response. I didn't spend a lot of time on reflex just because I feel like most of us kind of get reflex, right? Before we took this class, we get the idea. So it's just kind of putting names to it. And then this was the last thing we did. All right. So I'm gonna delete all of these in order to share my screen on my computer. Okay. So hopefully everybody got everything. Did you guys need a, hopefully if you needed another screen, you would have let me know. Okay, let me find you guys on here. Let's see. Okay. So this is our spinal cord on the whiteboard. And then we also have the spinal cord on the wood board. I prefer the wood board just because it's labeled, like it already has numbers for you guys and the whiteboard doesn't, but I will plan to do both. Okay, so this is kind of cool. It shows you what we were just talking about. General somatic afferent or sensory is the yellow. General visceral afferent is the green, right? Both in the posterior horn. General visceral efferent is in that lateral horn. And as you guys can see, it synapses in the sympathetic chain of ganglia. And then general somatic efferent is that motor in the posterior horn. Pretty neat, right? So now we kind of apply it onto the actual model. So this is, in my opinion, the most helpful model for, this was the most helpful model for me for learning a lecture. I remember feeling very confused on the spinal cord stuff. And so for me, this was very, very helpful. I'm gonna pull up the key just in case, like I always do, to just make sure I don't accidentally say something incorrect. So I can double check myself. So going back to here, so this would be like we were just talking about all this, right? This is the anterior ramus right here. Here is the posterior ramus, the one that supplies the dermatomes, posterior ramus. Here are the two rami communicantes that become the sympathetic chain of ganglia, right there. Here is the trunk of the spinal nerve, 26, trunk of spinal nerve. In the back, we have the dorsal root ganglion. Sometimes you'll see this called the spinal root ganglion, same thing. We know that that then becomes the sensory or the posterior root. Posterior root. Okay, I'll try to do it like that. There we go. So that's the root. These are the rootlets, sensory or posterior rootlets. I'm just going to label them as rootlets. I don't think we need to do the full name. So I'm going to put rootlets. Again, those would be sensory or posterior rootlets. Out the front, same thing. This is the anterior root, anterior or motor root. And then we have the rootlets as well. Rootlets. Then there's the posterior horn, lateral horn, and anterior horn. Because we've already said this several times, if you get confused or you don't know what I mean, that's fine, I can write it out. But I think we all know this, right? I'm going to put PH, posterior horn, LH, lateral horn, and then AH, anterior horn. Again, that's just because I feel like we've just gone over that. We should all get that, right? Posterior horn, lateral horn, anterior horn. This two, I think 2 should be for white matter, but if it's not, this whole area is white matter, right? We have a central commissure and a central canal. I think it's called let me make sure it's not called something else. 8 is the gray commissure and the central canal. The commissure is like a communication between both sides. So this little 8 right here is called the gray commissure. The word commissure references, like I said, like kind of a communication. So it kind of looks like the word communication between sides. So gray commissure is the communication between the left and right sides. Number 9 has a little tiny arrow, and it's pointing to the central canal, which when you guys are actually in lab, it's a lot easier to see the central canal, but it's like a little tiny canal that runs down the center. Okay. 4 should be the white commissure that joins the two sides of the white, which it is. So number 4 right here, kind of joining the two sides of the white matter. So this is your white commissure. And we have the anterior median fissure and the, do we have an anterior median sulcus? No. Anterolateral. So this is just the anterior median fissure. So in all of this, you guys remember back from the brain, I'm going to write them right here. Sulcus is a fall in the convolution. Do you remember this from Monday? Versus fissure would be a deep fall, right? So what you're going to see on this spinal cord, all these other little numbers on the side, is there's sulci and then there are fissures. Sulcus is like a little divot. So this right here is a little sulcus over here. 12, 11 are both sulcus. So this should be the posteromedian and posterolateral, just based off their location. So intermediate and posterolateral. I'm just going to label those first because it makes more sense to say it that way. This is intermediate sulcus. So this little guy right here, how it's kind of like a little divot, posterolateral sulcus. Again, this would be posterior side and lateral. Number 10 is the posterior median sulcus. It's again the same type of thing. It's like a little tiny divot here. Like I said, a sulcus is a fall versus a fissure is a deep fall. So I feel like I'm kind of running out of room here. Posterior median sulcus. Let's do pink. You can kind of see it, right? It's not like great, but you can kind of see it. Posterior median sulcus, intermediate sulcus, posterolateral sulcus. And then like I was just about to say on the very front, this 14, does everybody see how there's like a hole basically that 14 is pointing to? That's because this is a fissure. So this is an anterior median fissure. And like I said, the fissure is a deep fall. Okay. And then 13 should be anterolateral sulcus. So like I said, where it's just like basically this little tiny divot. I'll change the color because blue is starting to be everywhere. So anterolateral sulcus. And then for 1, 2, and 3, these are your funiculus that I was telling you about. So it's posterior, lateral, and anterior. Posterior, lateral, and anterior. And remember, like I've said several times, right? If something is in Latin, so this is the posterior funiculus, but on your key, it's called funiculi. That just means more than one, right? A funiculus is one, funiculi is multiple. So you can say either, but either would be correct on a multiple choice on the exam, right? If it says funiculus, that's correct. If it says funiculi, that's also correct. So lateral funiculus or funiculi, posterior funiculus or funiculi, and then lastly, anterior funiculus or funiculi. All right, so that should be everything on this view of the model. So let's, I'll move it so we can see the side just in case there's anything else. Let me look at the key here. Okay, so this is everything for this model. So if you wanted to take a picture, I know it's a little bit messy, but if you wanted to take a picture, this is everything you need to know on this model. Any questions? I'm going to erase this and we'll take a look at the whiteboard model. Okay, so again, there are different pictures here. This is the same model again. So I just labeled everything on one, but you can watch the video. You can see other parts, you can rotate it, but I was just trying to do everything in one. I don't really know what this picture is trying to say. There's no, you don't have, like, you don't need to know blood vessels. All right, so let's take a look at our whiteboard spinal cord. So this one does not have, I wish there was a way for me to rotate this. This one does not have any numbers at all, okay? Trying to get it to rotate, but I don't think it's going to rotate for me. All right, so we can just work with it on the side. At this point, you guys kind of get the idea of what's going on. So we have our, starting kind of from the back, our sensory, posterior, afferent, because it's going towards the spinal cord with information, rootlets. I'm not going to do the same thing for the root. Just know that it would be as a, like, this is like the grammatical way. Everything's the same. And then we call this one root. So sensory, posterior, afferent, root. Okay. And then we'll do the same thing for this side. These little part here, the part that like really sticks in, motor, anterior, efferent, rootlets. And again, it would be all the same naming here for the root, motor, anterior, efferent, root. And then we have our dorsal root ganglion, also called the spinal root ganglion or spinal ganglion. So you could see it named differently on your exam, right? So don't get like thrown off. I should have done this before. Don't get thrown off on the exam if you see it differently. Let me pull up the list so you can see. Spinal, did everybody see 3? Spinal ganglion or dorsal root ganglion. So again, these would be names for the same thing, dorsal root ganglion or spinal ganglion. So you need to know it either way. If on the multiple choice on the exam, it had either of those, both would be correct. Here's your posterior ramus. Or rami communicantes. And then your anterior ramus here. That becomes the nerve. And then the trunk of the spinal nerve right here, where they basically meet, where the motor and the sensory meet is the trunk of the spinal nerve. All right, and then looking at our actual thing here, posterior horn again, lateral horn, anterior horn. We have the same kind of stuff that you need to know again on here. So this would be our anterior median fissure. But what's kind of weird about this model is we have you know more of the sulci. So like right here, anterior median fissure, I believe there's a, let me see if I can find it. Anterior median fissure, and then, okay, I thought there was an anterior median sulcus, but there's not. We'll look at the other ones though. Then we have the anterolateral sulcus again, which is the same spot as we just did on that model. So this is the anterolateral sulcus. Anterolateral is the same as anterior lateral. Those would be the same thing. This would be the posterolateral sulcus. And our intermediate sulcus right here. Intermediate sulcus. And then our posterior median sulcus and posterior median fissure. Posterior median sulcus and then posterior median septum, it looks like. Sorry, my voice keeps cutting out. Posterior median septum. So right here, this like division point would be posterior median septum. And then just like before, you would have your white matter and your gray matter, which you guys know. And then I'm just going to see if you're supposed to know funiculus. Okay, so no funiculus. All right, so that's everything for this view. And then for this model, there's a few more things kind of on the side. So you could take a picture of that. All right. Okay, so now going to the side here on this model and not the other model. So this is definitely something where like if your test, this model is going to be on the test. I don't want to like say this wrong. This model is going to be on the test. It was on my test. Guaranteed you will be tested on what I'm about to show you in addition to the previous stuff. Okay, so I had stuff we just went over, but I also had these because these are very specific to this model and something we've gone over with you guys multiple times. So the duramater, everybody knows at this point, right? That should sound familiar. Arachnoid mater and pia mater. So those are the three layers you do see here, dura being the outside, arachnoid being kind of this little yellow one, pia like this part that sticks. And then this is an area where students tend to get it wrong on the test. I'm circling it. Does everybody kind of see this little white thing sticking out? That is your denticulate ligament, the one I was telling you about. It's like a triangular extension of pia mater that holds the spinal cord to the vertebral canal. It is not, I'm going to draw an X. It is not this, and it is not this. What would those be? Those are the cutoff version of this right here. And I've labeled that for you guys multiple times, right? The anterior motor efferent rootlets. So a lot of students on the exam labeled the rootlets as denticulate ligaments. They're not. They are the rootlets. They're just cut off because we're trying not to make this model have too much going on, but those are the cutoff versions of what's above it. Does that make sense? Let's go to the list. Central canal and gray commissure and white commissure are on here as well. I didn't label those. I can go back and show you. White matter, gray matter. Oh, subarachnoid space. They're titling each of these spinal arachnoid mater, spinal duramater. It's the same thing, spinal pia mater. I just wrote duramater, but you could put in front of it spinal duramater and it would still be correct. And this would be the subarachnoid space right here. So on the test, if that's labeled, it's like this little space right here, that is the subarachnoid space. Remember, that's where the CSF is floating, all of that good stuff. Subarachnoid space. The gray commissure is this little part here, is that gray commissure. Central canal is the part at the center here. It would be like the little divot. And then white commissure right here. All right, any questions there? That should be everything for this model as far as I can see on the list. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. Do you guys want to go over the brain model, or do you want to do the brain model next week on Monday? So to now or Monday? And then just type it in the chat for me if you guys don't mind. I need a few more people. I have 3 people for Monday and 2 people for now. So unless, anybody else in here want to say in the chat, you want to do it now or Monday? Now, okay, so now it's officially tied. So I need one more person. 1, 2, 3, whichever. Okay, one more person saying now or Monday, and then that way I can break the tie because you guys are tied right now. The brain model does take a little while. I can try to do it quickly, but we can also do it on Monday. So I need one more person. All right, Monday. All right, we'll do it on Monday. I will see you guys Monday. We will go over autonomic, the brain model, and then if we have time, we'll start the senses lecture as well. So don't miss Monday. Just keep coming to SI because these hopefully are saving you guys time when you study because I kind of outline the information. All right, and if you guys have questions, remember I am here until 12.